Las Vegas, Nevada. July 16, 2005. MGM Grand. The split decision is read aloud, and Bernard Hopkins does not move. Two judges have scored it for the younger man across from him. One judge has scored it for Hopkins. After 12 rounds, after 20 consecutive successful title defenses spanning more than a decade, after building a reign that nobody in the middleweight division had managed to touch since 1995, Bernard Hopkins has just lost his world championship to a 26-year-old from Little Rock, Arkansas, who the boxing world considered an unlikely threat at best. Hopkins's face does not register shock. It registers something closer to disbelief mixed with controlled fury, the specific expression of a man who has just watched something be taken from him that he does not believe was actually won. The young man's name is Jermain Taylor, and what happened between these two men, across two fights, a contested appeal, a rematch billed with a title that needed no explanation, and years of resentment that Hopkins never fully released, became one of the most personal rivalries middleweight boxing had seen in decades. This is the story of the man Bernard Hopkins never forgave. To understand why this loss cut so deep, you have to understand what Bernard Hopkins had already survived to get there. He grew up in the Raymond Rosen Housing Project in Philadelphia. By 13, he was mugging people on the street. He had been stabbed 3 times before he turned 18. At 17, he was sentenced to 18 years in Graterford Prison for 9 felonies, a sentence eventually reduced, but one that still meant nearly 5 years behind bars during what should have been the most formative years of his life. He witnessed a murder inside that prison, an argument over a pack of cigarettes that ended with another inmate dead on the floor in front of him. The warden, on the day Hopkins finally walked out in 1988, told him directly that he would see Hopkins again, that men like him always came back. Hopkins looked at him and said he was never coming back. He never did. What followed was one of the most improbable championship reigns in the history of the sport. Hopkins turned professional at 23. He converted to Islam. He worked washing pots and pans in a Philadelphia hotel kitchen because boxing alone could not pay the bills. He trained at an auto transmission shop owned by his trainer, Bowie Fisher, because that was where the work and the money actually were. He won the IBF middleweight title in 1995, and then he did something almost nobody in the sport's history had managed. He kept it, defense after defense, year after year. 20 successful title defenses against 17 different opponents, a middleweight record that put him in the same conversation as the legends who came before him. By 2005, Hopkins was 40 years old, the oldest reigning champion in the division. A man who had built his entire identity, not just his career, his actual sense of self, around the idea that he could not be beaten at his own weight class. Jermain Taylor was the 21st man to challenge that idea. Taylor's path to that ring could not have been more different from Hopkins's, and that difference became part of what made the entire build-up so charged. He was the pride of Little Rock, Arkansas, a 2000 Olympic bronze medalist, down-to-earth, polite, the kind of fighter that boxing media described as immensely likable, good-looking, soft-spoken, the type of personality that made him an easy story for journalists looking for a contrast to Hopkins's harder edges. Taylor's own life had not been easy. His father abandoned the family when he was 5. His grandmother, the woman who helped raise him alongside his mother and 3 younger sisters, was murdered by his own uncle when Taylor was 19, stabbed to death over a drug-fueled argument about money. Taylor found out while competing at the Goodwill Games. He came home, walked into her bedroom, and saw the blood still on the sheets and the floor. He put his Olympic bronze medal in her casket. That was the man Bernard Hopkins was about to face, and in the build-up to the fight, Hopkins did something that revealed exactly how he intended to fight this one. Not just with his hands, but with words designed to find whatever insecurity he could locate. At one press conference, Hopkins looked at Taylor and said that they were both African American, but that was where the similarity ended. He mocked Taylor's manner of speaking, said Taylor used phrases like "golly gee," that it was not Hopkins's style, that there was something almost performative about Taylor's politeness that Hopkins found beneath contempt. Taylor's response revealed something the audience had not fully understood about him. He said that as a child, he had a real stuttering problem, that he still dealt with it some, that it made trash talk difficult for him even when he wanted to engage in it. He said Hopkins could out-talk him. He said he was going to out-fight him instead. The negotiations leading up to the fight were openly acrimonious. Not theater, not promotional posturing, but genuine animosity rooted in Hopkins's history with Taylor's promoter, Lou DiBella. Hopkins had once been promoted by DiBella himself before leaving and making allegations of financial wrongdoing that ended in a $610,000 libel judgment against him in federal court. DiBella was now the man building Taylor's career. At the final pre-fight press conference, Hopkins barely acknowledged Taylor at all. He talked instead about moving up in weight afterward, about fighting Antonio Tarver or Roy Jones Jr. next, as if Taylor were a formality to be dispensed with on the way to bigger names entirely. That dismissal, the open assumption that Taylor was not even worth Hopkins's full attention, would come back to define everything that followed. July 16th, 2005. The fight itself was close, tactical, and exactly the kind of contest that experienced judges and casual fans could watch and reach entirely different conclusions about. Taylor used his jab effectively in the early rounds, controlling distance against a 40-year-old champion who was patient by design, waiting for the openings his experience told him would eventually appear. By round 10, Hopkins found those openings, hurt Taylor with right hands that visibly wobbled his legs, forced him into clinches, made the kind of late charge that had defined Hopkins's championship reign for a decade. It came too late on the scorecards. Two judges gave the fight to Taylor by a single point, 115 to 113. One judge gave it to Hopkins, 116 to 112. The numbers themselves told the story of how close and how genuinely disputable the entire fight had been. Hopkins did not accept the result quietly. He filed an official appeal with the Nevada State Athletic Commission, focusing specifically on the 12th round, a round where two judges had scored it for Hopkins, and one, Judge Jerry Roth, had scored it for Taylor. Hopkins argued directly that the discrepancy meant something had gone wrong in the scoring, that a fight watched by the same eyes should not produce that level of disagreement on a single round that determined the entire championship. He said it plainly, that he would be doing the sport a disservice if he did not challenge a result that was in dispute everywhere people were watching. The Nevada Commission reviewed the appeal and found nothing to support overturning the decision. They denied it 3 days later. Hopkins had lost his title, lost his appeal, and lost the specific certainty that had defined his entire career. The certainty that he was, by sheer force of will and preparation, simply better than the men across the ring from him. What he still had was a rematch clause. The rematch was billed, with deliberate and pointed simplicity, as no respect. That title was not marketing flourish. It was the most honest description possible of where Hopkins's mind actually was heading into December 3rd, 2005. He did not believe Taylor had beaten him. He believed a close fight had been mismanaged, that the sport had stripped a 40-year-old legend of everything he had built over a decade based on a single contested round, and that the only way to correct that was to do it again, more decisively, with no room left for judges to disagree. Taylor, for his part, had learned something from the first fight that he intended to apply directly. He had nearly run out of energy chasing Hopkins around the ring in the championship rounds of their first meeting, had barely held on for the victory after gassing out late. He told people directly that he would not make the same mistake twice. He kept his word in a way that frustrated everyone watching. The rematch was slow, cautious. Both men fighting not to lose rather than fighting to win, the natural consequence of two fighters who each understood exactly how much was riding on the outcome, and exactly how badly a single mistake could undo everything. The crowd at Mandalay Bay booed through long stretches of inactivity. The judges scored it unanimously for Taylor, 115 to 113 across all three cards. There was no appeal this time. There was no disputable single round to point toward. Jermain Taylor had beaten Bernard Hopkins twice, decisively enough on the second occasion that even Hopkins's own legendary stubbornness could not construct an argument against it. What Hopkins never fully released in the years that followed was not the loss itself. It was what the loss represented. He moved up to light heavyweight afterward and built an entirely new legacy there, defeating Antonio Tarver, becoming, at various points across the following decade, the oldest man in boxing history to win a world title, then the oldest to unify them. He fought into his late 40s and early 50s, defying every conventional understanding of what an aging fighter's body should be capable of. But Taylor's name carried weight in Hopkins's career narrative that no other opponents did. Not because Taylor had hit harder, or fought dirtier, or talked more trash than the dozens of other men Hopkins had faced. Because Taylor was the only man who had taken something from Hopkins that Hopkins genuinely believed, to the point of filing an official appeal with a state athletic commission, had not actually been earned. Every other loss across Hopkins's career, and there were 8 by the time he retired, could be processed and accepted as the normal outcome of a long career against elite competition. Taylor's victory sat differently. It sat as theft, dressed up in scorecards that Hopkins never stopped believing were wrong. Years later, in interviews reflecting on his career, Hopkins's language around certain opponents revealed exactly how unresolved some of these feelings remained. He used racially charged language describing some of the men who had beaten him in his later career. Comments he made no real effort to walk back. Comments that drew criticism even from boxing observers who otherwise respected his legacy. Taylor, for his part, never fully escaped the shadow those two fights cast over the rest of his own career. He went on to suffer brutal knockout losses to Kelly Pavlik in the years that followed. Losses that some observers connected directly to the punishment he had absorbed, surviving 24 rounds against a 40-year-old Hopkins who refused to stop hunting for the finish. The man who beat Bernard Hopkins twice never fully recovered the career trajectory that victory should have guaranteed him. And Bernard Hopkins, the executioner, a man who fought into his 50s, who broke George Foreman's own longevity record, who built one of the most statistically dominant careers middleweight boxing has ever produced, never stopped, in some corner of how he talked about his own legacy, treating those two fights against Jermain Taylor as the one chapter that did not belong in the story the way it was actually written. Las Vegas, Nevada, December 3rd, 2005, Mandalay Bay. The rematch had ended in silence and boos, a fight too cautious to satisfy anyone watching it live. But somewhere underneath the slow rounds and the unanimous scorecards was the actual ending of something that had started 5 months earlier with a single disputed round and an appeal that went nowhere. Bernard Hopkins built a Hall of Fame career on the specific belief that preparation and will could overcome anything the sport put in front of him. Jermain Taylor was the one name that taught him otherwise. Twice. And in the years that followed, across the title moves, the record-breaking victories, the decades of being recognized as one of the greatest defensive fighters the middleweight division ever produced, there remained one rivalry Hopkins never fully made peace with. Not because Taylor had been the most dangerous man he ever faced, because Taylor was the man who proved, in front of the entire world, that even Bernard Hopkins could be beaten at his own game. He never forgave him for it. This channel tells the stories underneath the records, the ones from Nevada commission hearings and contested rounds and rematches, billed with titles that needed no further explanation. Subscribe, because some losses get accepted, and some never do.